Katie Walsh pressed her face against the small window of the transport ship and watched the moon grow larger. Kepler 442c looked nothing like Earth's moon. This one had cities that glowed blue and green across its surface. Tall towers reached up into the thin atmosphere like metal fingers. She had never seen anything like it in her 19 years of life. The other passengers on the ship were mostly aliens. Katie tried not to stare, but it was hard. There were the tall gray ones with 4 arms that looked like they were made of stretched clay. Those were Zephyrians. She had studied about them before leaving Earth. There were also some that looked like walking trees with too many eyes, and others that seemed to be made of liquid metal that held a human shape. Katie pulled her backpack closer and checked her papers again. Everything was in order. She was the first human student to attend the Zephyrian Academy of Sciences. The paperwork said she was here as part of an exchange program, but Katie knew the truth. Earth wanted to prove that humans could keep up with the smart alien races. She was their test case. The transport ship docked with a soft bump. Katie gathered her things and followed the other passengers off the ship. The station was huge and bright. Everything was clean and white. Signs floated in the air in different languages. Katie found the ones written in English and followed them. Toward the Academy transport area, she sat on a bench and waited for her ride. A group of young Zephyrians walked past her. They were talking in their own language, but Katie caught a few words in English. They were laughing about something. One of them looked at her and said something that made the others laugh harder. Katie looked down at her shoes and pretended not to notice. The Academy transport arrived. It was a small hover bus that could fit about 20 people. Katie climbed on and found a seat near the back. Most of the other passengers were students like her. She could tell because they all looked nervous and carried bags full of books and computers. The ride to the Academy took about 30 minutes. Katie watched the alien city pass by outside. Everything was so different from her small town in Ohio. Back home, the tallest building was the grain elevator. Here, buildings stretched up so high she could not see their tops. The Zephyrian Academy of Sciences sat on a hill overlooking the city. It was made of the same white material as everything else, but it was older. Katie could tell because the edges were more rounded and the walls had patterns carved into them. Students of many different species walked around the grounds carrying bags and talking in small groups. Katie got off the transport and looked around. She felt very small. Everyone else seemed to know where they were going. She pulled out her papers and found the building number for the student housing office. It took her 20 minutes to find it. The housing officer was a Zephyrian female, with bright green markings on her gray skin. She looked at Katie's papers for a long time. Then she looked at Katie, then back at the papers. "You are the human," she said in English that sounded strange but clear. "Yes, ma'am," Katie said. "I have not seen a human before. You are smaller than I expected." Katie did not know what to say to that, so she just nodded. The officer gave her a room assignment and a map of the academy. "Your roommate is Centaurian." She requested a human roommate specifically. "Her name is Lyra." Katie thanked her and left. It took another 30 minutes to find her dorm building. The hallways were tall and wide to fit all the different types of students. Katie felt like a child walking through a house built for giants. She found her room and used the key card to open the door. The room was simple: 2 beds, 2 desks, 2 closets. One side was already taken. There were books written in a script Katie did not recognize and pictures of a planet with purple skies. "You must be Katie." Katie turned around. Her roommate stood in the doorway. Lyra was about Katie's height, but her skin was blue and she had small spots of silver all over her arms and face. Her eyes were larger than human eyes and completely black. "Hi," Katie said. "Nice to meet you. I am so excited to have a human roommate. I have read so much about your species. Is it true that you only have 2 arms?" Katie held up her arms. Just 2. Amazing. And you only live for about 100 years? If we're lucky. Lyra shook her head like this was very sad news. Well, we will make the most of the time we have together. Let me help you unpack. As they put Katie's things away, Lyra talked about the academy. She had been there for 2 years already. She told Katie about the different professors and which classes were the hardest. She also warned Katie about some of the students. The Zephyrians think they are the smartest species in the galaxy, Lyra said. They have been running this academy for 300 years. They do not like it when other species do better than them in class. What about humans? Katie asked. Number 1 knows yet. You are the first one here. Some students are curious about you. Others think humans are too primitive to be here. That night, Katie lay in her bed and listened to the strange sounds of the alien moon outside her window. Back home in Ohio, she would hear crickets and maybe a car driving down the road. Here, she heard the hum of machines and the calls of creatures she had never seen. She thought about her parents, back on Earth. Her dad worked at the car factory and her mom was a teacher at the elementary school. They were proud of her for getting into the academy, but they were also scared. Katie was scared too, but she would never admit it. The next morning, Lyra showed her around the campus. The academy was huge. There were buildings for every type of science you could think of. Physics, chemistry, biology, engineering, and subjects that Katie had never heard of. Students from dozens of different species walked between classes. Katie's first class was Advanced Theoretical Physics. She found the classroom and took a seat near the back. The other students were mostly Zephyrians with a few other species mixed in. They all looked very serious and smart. The professor walked in exactly when class was supposed to start. He was a tall Zephyrian with dark gray skin and silver markings around his eyes. His 4 arms moved independently as he set up his materials. At the front of the room, I am Professor Zexthul, he said in a voice that was deep and clear. This is Advanced Theoretical Physics. If you are not supposed to be here, leave now. No one moved. Professor Zexthul's eyes scanned the room. When they reached Katie, they stopped. He stared at her for several seconds. Katie looked down at her notebook and tried to make herself smaller. I see we have a new species joining us this semester, the professor said. His voice had changed. It sounded colder now. I hope our human friend understands that this is not a basic science class for beginners. Some of the Zephyrian students made clicking sounds that Katie guessed was laughter. She felt her face get hot, but she did not look up. Professor Zexthul began his lecture. Katie took notes and tried to follow along. The math was complicated, but not more complicated than what she had studied back on Earth. She had always been good at math and physics. That was why she was here. But as the class went on, she noticed that Professor Zexthul kept looking at her. Every few minutes, his eyes would find her in the back of the room. And every time he looked at her, his expression got a little more unfriendly. 3 weeks passed at the academy. Katie settled into a routine of classes, studying, and trying to avoid attention. She ate her meals with Lyra and a few other friendly students from different species. Most of the time, she felt like she was doing okay. The work was hard, but not impossible. Professor Zexthul made every class difficult for her. He would ask her questions that he never asked the other students. When she got an answer right, he would frown and move on quickly. When she got an answer wrong, he would spend several minutes explaining why humans were not ready for advanced science. Miss Walsh, he said during one class, perhaps you should consider taking remedial mathematics before attempting theoretical physics. Katie had gotten one small part of a problem wrong. The Zephyrian student next to her had made 3 mistakes on the same problem, but the professor had not said anything to him. I understand the concept, Professor, Katie said quietly. I just made an error in my calculations. Errors show a lack of proper thinking. Professor Zexthul replied. Precise thinking is what separates advanced species from primitive ones. Katie felt her face get hot again, but she did not argue. She just nodded and wrote down the correct answer. After class, Lyra waited for her in the hallway. You should report him, she said as they walked to the cafeteria. What he is doing is not fair. It's okay, Katie said. I can handle it. No, it is not okay. He is trying to make you quit. I have seen him do this before to students he does not like. Katie thought about this. Back home in Ohio, she had dealt with people who did not think she was smart enough. Her high school math teacher had tried to put her in a lower class because she was quiet and came from a farm family. Katie had proved him wrong by getting the highest score on the state math test. I'm not going to quit, she told Lyra. The next day in class, Professor Zexthul seemed to be in an especially bad mood. He paced back and forth at the front of the room, his forearms moving as he talked. He was explaining a problem about energy transfer between dimensions. Katie followed along easily, but she could see that some of the other students were struggling. This problem has been studied by the greatest minds in the galaxy for over 50 years, the professor said. No one has been able to solve it completely. It represents the kind of thinking that separates truly advanced species from those that are still learning to use tools. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Katie when he said the part about using tools. Several students turned to look at her too. Professor Zexthul walked over to the holographic display at the front of the room. With his forearms, he began bringing up equations and diagrams. The display showed a complex mathematical problem that filled the entire space above the professor's desk. Numbers and symbols floated in the air, connected by lines and curves that hurt Katie's eyes to look at. This is the Zephyrian multidimensional energy matrix problem, he announced. It has been the final project for graduate students here for decades. Most of them cannot solve it even after years of study. The class was very quiet. Katie could hear the soft humming of the holographic display and the breathing of the students around her. I am going to make an offer, Professor Zexthul continued. Any student who can solve this problem will receive full marks for this entire semester. They will not need to take the final exam or complete any other assignments. This got the attention of every student in the room. Full marks for the semester was something that almost never happened. Katie sat up straighter in her chair. However, the professor said, and his voice got colder, any student who attempts to solve this problem and fails will be immediately expelled from the academy. They will be sent home in disgrace, and their failure will be noted in their permanent academic record. Now the room was completely silent. No one even seemed to be breathing. Professor Zexthul smiled, which was not a pleasant sight on a Zephyrian face. So, does anyone feel confident enough to try? Remember, this problem has defeated some of the most brilliant graduate students we have ever had. Katie looked at the equations floating in the air. At first, they seemed impossible. There were variables she had never seen before and mathematical concepts that were not taught on Earth. But as she studied them, something started to make sense. The basic structure of the problem was familiar. It reminded her of something she had learned in high school. She thought about chaos theory and fractal mathematics. Her teacher back home had been excited about these concepts and had taught them, even though they were not part of the regular curriculum. Katie had found them interesting because they described the patterns she saw in nature on her family's farm. The other students were looking around nervously. A few of the Zephyrian students seemed to be considering the challenge, but none of them raised their hands. Katie could see the fear in their eyes. Being expelled would ruin their future careers. Minutes passed. Professor Zexthul walked back and forth in front of the display, waiting. Katie could tell he was enjoying the power he had over the students. He was making them choose between safety and the chance for academic glory. No one? He asked. Perhaps I overestimated the quality of this year's students. Katie felt something change inside her. This was the same feeling she had gotten back home when people told her she was not smart enough, or that farm kids did not belong in advanced classes. It was a quiet anger that made her think more clearly instead of making her upset. She looked at the problem again. The more she studied it, the more she understood. The solution was there, hidden in the complexity. She could see it like a path through a forest that others could not find. Slowly, Katie raised her hand. The room went completely silent. Every head turned to look at her. Professor Zexthul stopped pacing and stared at her with all four of his eyes wide open. "Miss Walsh," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Are you certain you want to attempt this?" "Yes, Professor," Katie said. "You understand that failure means expulsion?" "I understand." Professor Zexthul's expression changed. The surprise on his face was replaced by something that looked like excitement. But it was not the good kind of excitement. It was the expression of someone who was about to watch something they had been hoping for. "Very well," he said. "Please come to the front of the room." Katie gathered her things and walked down the aisle between the desks. She could feel every eye in the room watching her. When she reached the front, Professor Zexthul gestured toward the holographic display. "The problem is yours, Miss Walsh," he said. "I hope you have said goodbye to your friends here, because I do not expect you will be seeing them again after today." Katie looked up at the complex equations floating in the air above her. She did not respond to the professor's comment. Instead, she began to study the problem more carefully. She had committed herself now. There was no going back. Behind her, she could hear Professor Zexthul moving around. She heard him speaking quietly to some of the Zephyrian students in their own language. She caught a few words that she understood. They were not nice words. Katie blocked out the distractions and focused on the mathematics. She had learned a long time ago that the best way to deal with people who wanted her to fail was to prove them wrong. Katie stood in front of the holographic display and studied the floating equations. The other students were completely silent behind her. She could feel their eyes watching her every move. Some of them probably thought she was crazy for trying this. Others might have been hoping she would succeed, just to see Professor Zexthul proven wrong. The problem looked impossible at first glance. There were equations within equations, and variables that seemed to have no clear relationship to each other. The mathematical symbols came from several different alien cultures, some of which Katie had never seen before. But she had always been good at seeing patterns, even when they were hidden. Back home on the farm, her father had taught her to read the weather by looking at cloud formations and feeling changes in the air pressure. Her mother had shown her how to predict when the cows were going to get sick by watching small changes in their behavior. Katie had learned that the most important information was often in the details that other people missed. She began to work with the holographic interface. The display responded to her touch, allowing her to move equations around and highlight different parts. As she manipulated the mathematics, she started to see connections that were not obvious before. The problem was about energy moving between different dimensions. The alien mathematicians had approached it by trying to track every possible pathway the energy could take. They had created enormously complex calculations to account for every variable. But Katie realized they were making it too complicated. She thought about her high school physics teacher, Mr. Johnson. He had always said that nature liked simple solutions. "The universe is complicated," he would tell his students, "but the rules that govern it are usually elegant and simple." Katie began to remove parts of the equations that she thought were unnecessary. Behind her, she heard some of the students gasp. Professor Zexthul made a clicking sound that meant disapproval. In Zephyrian culture, "Miss Walsh," the professor said in a voice that was trying to sound helpful but was actually mocking, "I think you are making an error. Those variables are essential to the problem." Katie did not turn around. "I don't think they are, Professor," she said quietly. I think they're just making it harder to see the real solution. The greatest minds in the galaxy have worked on this problem for 50 years, Professor Zexthol replied. I doubt a human student can see something they missed. Katie continued working. She was starting to see the problem differently now. Instead of thinking about it as energy moving through dimensions, she began to think about it as a pattern. Back in Ohio, she had studied fractals in her advanced math class. Fractals were patterns that repeated themselves at different scales. They looked complicated, but they were based on simple rules. The energy matrix problem had the same kind of structure. There was a basic pattern that repeated itself throughout the different dimensions. Once Katie saw this, the solution became much clearer. She began to work faster now. Her hands moved across the holographic display, rearranging equations and simplifying complex calculations. The mathematics started to make sense in a way that felt natural to her. It was like solving a puzzle where all the pieces suddenly fit together. Behind her, the room remained silent, but she could feel the tension building. She knew that Professor Zexthol was getting angry. She could hear his breathing getting faster, and his forearms rustling against his clothing as he moved restlessly. Katie thought about her younger brother Jake back home. He was still in high school, but he was even better at math than she was. When they were kids, they used to compete to see who could solve word problems faster. Jake always found shortcuts that Katie missed. He would look at a complicated problem and somehow see the simple answer hidden inside it. That was what she was doing now. She was finding the simple answer that was hidden inside all the complicated alien mathematics. As she worked, Katie began to use some concepts that she had learned on Earth, but that were not part of standard galactic education. She used chaos theory to understand how small changes in the energy patterns could create large effects in different dimensions. She used fractal mathematics to see how the same basic pattern repeated at different scales. The alien students behind her had never encountered these approaches before. Earth mathematics had developed differently from alien mathematics because humans thought about problems in a different way. Where alien species relied on pure logic and computational power, humans used intuition and pattern recognition. Katie's solution was starting to take shape. The complex web of equations was simplifying into something much more elegant. She could see the end now. Just a few more calculations and she would have the complete answer. Professor Zexthol realized what was happening. Katie could hear him moving around behind her, his forearms probably clenched into fists. In Zephyrian culture, being outsmarted by a member of what they considered a lesser species was the worst kind of humiliation. "This is impossible," she heard him mutter in English. Then he said something in Zephyrian that sounded angry. Katie ignored him and kept working. She was almost done now. The final pieces of the solution were falling into place. The mathematics was beautiful in its simplicity once you saw it the right way. She made the last few adjustments to the equations. The holographic display showed the complete solution floating in the air above her. It was elegant and clean, using about 1/10 of the variables that the original problem had contained. Katie stepped back and looked at her work. It was correct, she was sure of it. The solution felt right in a way that she could not explain to someone who was not human. It was the same feeling she got when she solved a difficult puzzle, or when she figured out why the tractor was not running properly. The room was completely silent now. Katie turned around to face the class. Every student was staring at the holographic display with expressions of amazement. Some of them had their mouths open. Others were frantically taking notes, trying to understand how she had done it. Professor Zexthol stood at the side of the room. His gray skin had turned a darker color, which Katie knew meant he was either very angry or very embarrassed, probably both. His forearms were trembling slightly. "Professor?" Katie said quietly, "Is the solution correct?" Professor Zexthol did not answer immediately. He was staring at the display like he could not believe what he was seeing. Finally, he walked over to examine her work more closely. His 4 eyes moved back and forth across the equations, checking each step of her calculation. Katie waited patiently. She was confident in her answer, but she also knew that the professor would look for any excuse to say she was wrong. She had done this kind of thing before with teachers who did not want to admit that she was right. After several minutes, Professor Zexthul straightened up. His expression was dark and angry, but Katie could see something else there too. It was fear. He was afraid that she had actually solved the problem that had stumped the greatest alien minds for 50 years. The mathematics appear to be correct, he said in a voice that sounded like he was being forced to speak. The class erupted in excited chatter. Students turned to each other and began talking rapidly in their various languages. Katie heard her name mentioned several times, but Professor Zexthul was not finished. Katie could see that his anger was building to something dangerous. His breathing was getting faster and his 4 arms were moving in agitated patterns. In his culture, this kind of public humiliation could not be allowed to stand. Katie could see that Professor Zexthul was losing control. His gray skin was getting darker by the minute, and all 4 of his arms were moving in sharp, angry gestures. The other students in the class were still talking excitedly about her solution, but they had not noticed how dangerous the professor was becoming. "Silence!" Professor Zexthul shouted, and the room went quiet immediately. His voice had a harsh quality that Katie had never heard before. "This is impossible. A human cannot solve a problem that has defeated our greatest minds for 50 years. Katie remained calm. She had dealt with angry adults before. When she was in high school, the principal had accused her of cheating on a math test because her score was too high. Her father had taught her to stay calm in situations like this and let the facts speak for themselves. "The solution is there for everyone to see, Professor," she said quietly. "The mathematics are correct. Mathematics can be faked." The professor snapped. "Humans are known for their deceptive nature. You must have found this solution somewhere else and memorized it." Now Katie felt a flash of anger. Being called a cheater was something she would not tolerate, but she kept her voice steady. "I solved it myself, Professor. You can check every step of my work." Several students in the class began to murmur. They had watched Katie work through the problem step by step. There was no way she could have faked it. Even Lyra, who was sitting near the back of the room, stood up and said, "Professor, we all saw her solve it. She did not cheat." Professor Zexthul turned his attention to Lyra. "You will be silent, or you will join your human friend in expulsion." This made Katie angry. Lyra was just trying to be fair, and now she was being threatened too. Katie took a step toward the professor. "Don't threaten my friends," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but there was something in it that made the professor look at her more carefully. "Your friends?" Professor Zexthul laughed, but it was not a pleasant sound. "You think these aliens are your friends? They tolerate you because they have to. But they all know that humans do not belong here." Katie looked around the room. Some of the students were looking uncomfortable. Others were nodding in agreement with the professor. But she could see that several of them, including Lyra, were shaking their heads. She realized that the professor was trying to make her feel isolated and alone. "Maybe some of them think that," Katie said. "But I don't care. I came here to learn, not to make friends. And I've proved that I can do the work." Professor Zexthul's expression became even more angry. "You have proved nothing. This solution is worthless. It uses primitive human concepts that have no place in advanced galactic science." "The solution works," Katie replied. "That's all that matters." "No," Professor Zexthul shouted. "What matters is that species know their place in the galaxy. Humans are newcomers. You are barely above the level of animals. You do not get to waltz in here and pretend to be equals with races that have been studying science for thousands of years. The room was completely silent now. Even the students who had been agreeing with the professor looked uncomfortable. He had gone too far, and everyone knew it. Katie felt her anger growing, but she also felt something else. She felt the same calm determination that had gotten her through difficult times back home. When the bank had tried to foreclose on her family's farm, she had helped her father go through all the paperwork and find the mistakes in the bank's calculations. When her high school guidance counselor had told her she was not college material, she had studied harder and proved him wrong. "Professor," she said, and her voice was very calm now, "I think you're upset because a human solved a problem that you couldn't solve. That's okay. Everyone makes mistakes." This was the wrong thing to say. Professor Zexthel's face went completely dark, and his 4 arms began to tremble with rage. In Zephyrian culture, being told you made a mistake by someone you considered inferior was the ultimate insult. "How dare you!" he screamed. "I am a professor at the most prestigious academy in the galaxy. I have been studying theoretical physics since before your species discovered fire." Katie did not back down. "And I'm a farm girl from Ohio who just solved your impossible problem. What does that tell you?" That was the moment when Professor Zexthel completely lost control. He had been building toward this explosion for weeks, ever since Katie had first walked into his classroom. All of his anger and humiliation came together in one moment of pure rage. He lunged forward with all 4 arms extended, trying to reach the holographic display to destroy Katie's solution. His goal was to erase her work and then physically remove her from the classroom. In his mind, if he could destroy the evidence of her success, he could pretend it had never happened. But Katie had been watching him carefully. Growing up on a farm had taught her to read the behavior of large, potentially dangerous animals. She had seen bulls getting ready to charge and horses preparing to kick. She recognized the signs of an attack before it happened. More importantly, Katie had been taking martial arts classes since she was 8 years old. Her instructor back home had been a former Marine who believed that everyone should know how to defend themselves. He had taught Katie that the best defense was often the simplest one. As Professor Zexthel charged toward her, Katie took one small step backward. She did not panic or try to run. Instead, she extended her left arm in what looked like a casual gesture, as if she was just reaching out to steady herself. The timing was perfect. Professor Zexthel's momentum carried him directly into her outstretched arm. What he did not understand was that human bones were much denser than Zephyrian bones. What he also did not know was that Katie had spent her childhood lifting hay, bales, and wrestling with farm animals that were much stronger than she was. The impact sent a shock through Professor Zexthelius' extended arm. His bones, which were designed for flexibility and reach rather than strength, could not handle the sudden force. Katie's arm, backed by the leverage of her entire body and the professor's own momentum, acted like an immovable barrier. The sound of his arm breaking was loud and sharp, like a stick snapping in half. It echoed through the silent classroom and seemed to hang in the air for several seconds. Professor Zexthel fell to the floor, clutching his broken arm with his other 3 hands. He was making high-pitched sounds that Katie guessed were Zephyrian. Expressions of pain. Katie had not moved from her position. She was still standing calmly next to the holographic display, her arm still extended from the defensive gesture. She looked down at the professor with an expression of mild concern, as if she was sorry that he had hurt himself. "Are you okay, Professor?" she asked in the same quiet voice she had been using all along. The other students were staring in shock. None of them had expected the situation to turn physical, and none of them had expected it to end so quickly. The human girl had barely moved, but somehow the professor was on the floor with a broken arm. Katie turned back to the holographic display and made a final adjustment to her solution. I think my answer is complete now, she said to the class. Unless anyone has questions about the mathematics. Nobody had any questions. They were all too busy staring at Professor Zexthel, who was still lying on the floor making painful noises. Katie gathered her things and walked back to her seat. She sat down and opened her notebook as if nothing unusual had happened. The solution to the impossible problem still floated in the air above the classroom, elegant and beautiful in its simplicity. The Academy security team arrived within minutes. Someone in the class had pressed the emergency button that was installed in every classroom. 3 Zephyrian guards rushed in, expecting to find a student in trouble. Instead, they found Professor Zexthel on the floor holding his broken arm while Katie sat calmly in her seat taking notes. What happened here? The lead security officer asked. He was an older Zephyrian with scars on his arms that suggested he had seen real combat before becoming a campus guard. Several students began talking at once, all in different languages. The security officer held up his hand for silence. 1 at a time, he said. You first, he pointed to a Zephyrian student in the front row. Professor Zexthel attacked the human student, the student said quickly. She was just defending herself. That is not what happened, Professor Zexthel managed to say through his pain. She assaulted me. I want her arrested. The security officer looked around the room. Is there a recording of this class? Yes, said another student. All classes are recorded for review purposes. The security officer activated his communication device and requested the recording. While they waited, medical personnel arrived to treat Professor Zexthel's broken arm. The medics, who were also Zephyrians, looked shocked when they examined the injury. This is a complete fracture, one of them said. The bone is broken in 3 places. What hit him? She did. Professor Zexthel pointed at Katie with one of his good arms. That human attacked me without provocation. Katie finally spoke up. I was defending myself, Professor. You lunged at me first. The security officer's communication device beeped. He watched something on a small screen, his expression becoming more serious as the recording played. When it finished, he looked at Professor Zexthel with disappointment. Professor, the recording clearly shows you attacking Miss Walsh. She barely moved, and you ran into her arm. This was self-defense, not assault. Professor Zexthel's face went even darker. That is impossible. Humans are weak. They cannot break Zephyrian bones. Apparently they can, the medic said as he finished putting a temporary brace on the professor's arm. This injury required significant force. Miss Walsh must be much stronger than she appears. Katie said nothing. She had learned long ago that it was better to stay quiet and let other people figure things out for themselves. The Academy administration was called in next. Dean Veltar, the head of the physics department, arrived within the hour. She was an elderly Zephyrian female with a reputation for being fair but strict. She reviewed the recording and interviewed several students before speaking to Katie. Miss Walsh, she said, I need to understand exactly what happened here. Why did you attempt that problem? Professor Zexthel offered it to the class, Katie replied. He said anyone who solved it would get full marks for the semester. And you believed you could solve a problem that has stumped our graduate students for decades? Katie shrugged. I thought I could try. The worst that could happen was I would get expelled, and I was prepared for that risk. Dean Veltar studied the solution that was still floating in the holographic display. Your approach is completely different from anything we have seen before. These mathematical concepts are not taught in our curriculum. They're taught on Earth. Katie said, we call them chaos theory and fractal mathematics. I learned them in high school. High school? Dean Veltar looked surprised. These are advanced concepts that we consider graduate-level research. Maybe that's why no one here could solve the problem, Katie said simply. Sometimes you need a different perspective. Over the next several days, news of what had happened spread throughout the academy and beyond. Katie's solution was reviewed by mathematicians from across the galaxy. Not only was it correct, but it opened up entirely new areas of research that no one had considered before. The story became even more interesting when details about the physical confrontation were revealed. The fact that a small human girl had broken a Zephyrian professor's arm without even trying hard made people curious about human capabilities. Katie found herself suddenly famous in ways she had never wanted. Students from other species began approaching her with questions about human mathematics and human fighting techniques. Reporters from galactic news services requested interviews. "I don't understand what the big deal is," she told Lyra one evening as they studied in their room. "I just solved a math problem and defended myself when someone attacked me." "You don't understand because you are human," Lyra explained. "To the rest of us, what you did seems impossible. No one expected humans to be capable of either advanced mathematics or physical dominance over Zephyrians." "We're not physically dominant," Katie said. "Professor Zexthul just ran into my arm at the wrong angle. If he had been thinking clearly, he could have easily overpowered me. But he was not thinking clearly, and you were. That is the point." Within a week, Katie received messages from universities across the galaxy asking if she would consider transferring to their schools. Research institutions wanted to study her mathematical approaches. Even the Galactic Science Council sent a formal inquiry about human educational methods. Professor Zexthul, meanwhile, had been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. The recording of his attack on Katie had been viewed millions of times across the galactic network. His reputation as a scholar was destroyed, and several of his previous papers were being re-examined for bias against non-Zephyrian species. Katie felt a little sorry for him, but not much. He had brought his problems on himself by being cruel and arrogant. The most significant change was in how other species viewed humans. Before Katie's demonstration, humans had been seen as newcomers who might eventually become useful junior partners in galactic civilization. Now they were seen as potentially valuable equals who brought unique perspectives to complex problems. Earth's government received formal requests from dozens of planets asking for human exchange students and researchers. The human embassy on the Galactic Council's home world was suddenly very busy with meeting requests. 3 months later, Katie received a message from her parents back in Ohio. Her father wrote that he was proud of her for standing up for herself and for representing Earth so well. Her mother reminded her to eat properly and get enough sleep. Her younger brother Jake wrote that he had decided to study physics too, and he wanted to know if she could help him with his homework when she came home for winter break. Katie smiled as she read the messages. Despite all the changes and attention, her family was still the same. That was exactly what she needed. She was sitting in the same seat in the back of the classroom where the whole thing had started. There was a new professor now, a quiet Centaurian female, who treated all students with respect. The class was studying a new problem, one that had been inspired by Katie's solution to the energy matrix. Katie took notes and listened to the lecture, just like any other student. She had achieved something remarkable, but she approached it the same way she approached everything else, with quiet determination and a refusal to be impressed with herself. When the class ended, she gathered her things and walked out with Lyra and their other friends. Tomorrow there would be new problems to solve and new challenges to face. Katie was looking forward to all of it. After all, she was just getting started.